शेअर चालू आहे.
तो करायचं असेल
we'll have to share ना.
स्क्रीन कशाला शेअर
त्याच्याशिवाय कसं म्हणा.
स्क्रीन कशाला शेअर करायचं.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hello.
DP.
Hello.
DP.
Hello.
Good afternoon, madam.
I think
Has
everyone
our
is.
guest joined, DP?
Yeah, guest has joined.
And Madhura madam, Himanshu sir,
Yeah,
madam.
everyone has joined.
Dr. Saab,
Dr. Saab has also joined.
he has joined. Okay.
Yeah.
Himanshu sir,
Evita, I think Evita is going to start, I think.
okay. Evita is already there.
Yeah, she is already there.
Okay.
whiteboard असतो म्हणजे
हे सगळं आधी सांगायचं ना मग.
मला थोडी माहिती.
मम्मा 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 मगर चालू करतली शांत प्लीज शांत.
Ma'am, Evita सर्वे आगे.
Himanshu sir, you can
Yes,
start.
madam.
Then Evita will join.
Okay,
Or
madam.
Evita को
I'm
unmute
here
करना
ma'am.
चाहिए.
I'm here ma'am.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah, I know.
here ma'am.
Okay.
One
Evita
second. One
madam
second. Yeah ma'am, I'm here. Am I audible ma'am?
Yes, please.
Yeah ma'am. Shall we?
Yes, please.
Yeah ma'am. Yeah. A very good afternoon to our Honorable Secretary Dr. Rajendra Singh sir, our Director Dr. Mrs. Usha Mukundan madam, guest speaker for the day Dr. Mrs. Zai Vaidya madam, Principal of Ramranjan Jhunjhunwala College, Dr. Himanshu Davda sir, Principal of Ramranjan Principal of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti's College of Law, Dr. Mrs. Madhura Kalamkar madam, various principals, advocates, teachers, and student participants. I, Ms. Evita Fernandez, on behalf of both the colleges, extend a very sincere warm welcome to all of you to our webinar and lecture series on women and law. I would like to start with a quote by a French feminist and a philosopher. She has written this a book called as The Second Sex, which is also called as the Feminist Bible. So I would like to quote her where she says, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." The word feminism in its history has been evolved by the three waves or revolutions that have changed or molded how we see women in today's world. Today, we are gathered here to understand the particulars of women and the laws associated with it. With this, I request Dr. Rajendra sir to address the audience by his words of wisdom. Over to you, Rajendra sir. Sir, your mic is off.
But it has been muted. Okay. Now, am I audible now?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon,
Director
sir.
of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti, Dr. Usha Mukundan Madam, Principal of RJ College, Dr. Himanshu Davda Sir, Principal of HPPS College of Law, Dr. Madhura Kalamkar Madam, our guest speaker of today's seminar, Advocate Jai Vaidya Madam, all the participants, including advocates, students, and all our members of academic faculty. I welcome all of you to this seminar on behalf of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti that has been organized by RJ College as well and HUPS College of Law. It's taken by both the principals, Dr. Madhura Kalamkar and Dr. Himanshu Davda, and properly guided by our director, Dr. Usha Mukundan. In this era of lockdown, where we are confined to our homes, we are still active to impart knowledge to our students. That shows our concern for the betterment of the students. I wish all the best for the success of this seminar. Thanks everybody and thanks all.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
sir.
sir. Thank you so much, sir. Now I request our director, Dr. Usha Mukundan, madam, to address the audience. Over to you,
Abhijit,
ma'am. Yeah, ma'am.
the best, and I'm very sure we are all very eagerly waiting to
Yeah,
listen
ma'am.
to Advocate Jai Vaidya, madam. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and welcome to HVPS. Thank you, madam.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I request Principal of Ramnaranjan Jhunjhunwala College, Dr. Himanshu Dowda, sir, to address the audience.
Thanks, Evita. But as Usha madam said, we are too eager to hear madam.
All
This
right, sir.
is,
So yeah.
We'll start the session. We welcome you, madam, and we are waiting for your session. Shall we start,
Oh,
Evita?
yes. Yeah, sir. Thank you, sir. Principal of HPPS College of Law, Dr. Madhura, ma'am. I request you to kindly welcome our chief guest.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon,
It's my
ma'am.
pleasure to welcome on behalf of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti's Law College and Ramnaranjan Jhunjhunwala College to our trustee sir, Dr. Rajendra Singh sir, our director, Dr. Usha Mukundan madam, our principal of RJ College, Dr. Himanshu Dowda, and all principals, teachers, advocates, students, and my college staff on today's online webinar gathering with more than 300 participants. Today we have with us Advocate Jai Vaidya ma'am, who is going to address on today's topic, the perspectives in feminist legal theory. About introducing her, I would like to share that she is practicing for over 20 years in civil and criminal law. She is the founder and trustee of NGO Samanvay, which works for women and family laws. She is a recipient of Young Professional Achiever Award by Maharashtra Times, Times Group, and Best Legal Column Award from Marathi Patrakar Sangh for legal column in Maharashtra Times. She consistently writing on women and law and women's issues since 2004-5 in all leading newspapers, including Maharashtra Times, Lok Satta, Sakal. She worked as a legal advisor to the State Commission for Women in honorary capacity. She is a corporate trainer and advisor on Sexual Harassment Act. She have worked as an independent member of Internal Inquiry Committee set up under orders of High Court with State Commission for Women's and other corporate. So, to start with the session, I would like to explain that she is going to explain about the objectives of and concepts and interpretations of various acts for the woman. Why there is a gap between the acceptance of these laws in today's social setup, and what kind of changes are coming up with the present situation in a family code. So the concept of feminist jurisprudence was coined near about 60s, 70s for achieving equality for the woman by challenging various different laws. So as a parent, wife, daughter, employee, and woman, there are laws set in place to protect us, and we must aware about these laws, as these laws gives power to women to fight against the hardship such as discrimination, harassment, violence, and abuse. So she should set her mind that she could build her own world, as today she proved in every aspects of her life that she is also competent to fight against this world. So I would request to Jai Vaidya ma'am to continue with the session. Thank you. Over to Jai Vaidya ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, all the dignitaries of the Law College, for welcoming so warmly to your family and inviting me to speak on this subject. This is one of the subjects that very rarely we speak about in our practice. In academics, when we talk about or take our education in law, we learn about various jurisprudential theories, but feminist jurisprudence is something which has always remained outside. Although this has been the case, we see that the feminist jurisprudence as a theory has been applied by the courts in the day-to-day matters. It is applied by the legislature while passing various enactments, What we need to do is we need to understand in the purpose of various laws. When we talk about laws, the first thing we always begin with is the Constitution of India, the supreme law of the country. The Constitution by itself has a purpose, and that purpose has been social engineering. Now, what is this concept of social engineering? Social engineering is all about creating a desirable social, particular desirable social order, system, and hierarchy in the society. The Constitution of India mandates it through the various articles, granting and protecting fundamental rights of its citizens, and provides for enacting special laws for raising the standards of the weaker sections of the society and to bring about equality. We all know that. What we don't know is how this social engineering concept is applied and used in our day-to-day practice, how it has been applied by the courts through the judgments, and how it has brought about the social desired changes is what we are going to see through, or rather through this study which I have tried to do. After this understanding this concept of social engineering, we come to understand where does this social engineering come from. It is said that key to any law is the preamble of that law. The Constitution too has a preamble. And if we see that preamble, the Constitution itself tells us, in fact, the preamble is an oath which we have taken when we say we the people. The preamble states that we shall endeavor to secure to all its citizens justice. Justice, which will be social justice, economic justice, and political justice, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship, equality of status of opportunity, fraternity, ensuring the dignity of the individual, and unity and integrity of the nation. So, when we are talking about this preamble, the exact spirit of the preamble, as we know, has been embodied in the fundamental rights. I am not, if we start with this subject, I know it is a very vast subject, an unending subject. However, considering the paucity of the time and the limitations of this medium as well, I'm going to keep myself restricted to the scope of this lecture. So the main fundamental rights that we will be talking about would be Article 14, right to equality, where the equality before the law, the state shall not deny to any person equality before the law and equal protection of the laws within the territory of India. So state shall not deny, which presupposes that there is already an equality before the law. The Constitution presupposes it, and it has to ensure, the courts have to ensure that it is not denied to anybody. Article 15 speaks about prohibition of discrimination on any of the grounds: religion, race, caste, creed, sex, place of birth, or any one of them, or all of them together. Here today, when we are talking about the feminist jurisprudence, we are concerned about the discrimination on the ground of sex. The Article 15 has a proviso in subsection 3 which says, nothing in this article shall prevent the state from making any special provision for the women and children. So the article has specifically mentioned that there will be certain provisions made for the benefit of the women because the women are recognized as the weaker sex. Now, here we have to understand the times when the Constitution was passed and how the feminists thought when it, as Kalamkar madam has said very correctly, it did come to, its origins are in 1960s, and the Constitution as we have adopted was before that. So considering this, it speaks about the women as the weaker section who require the protection. The feminist jurisprudence has developed from this view of need for protection, and how we will see in the course of this lecture. And then the next important article is Article 21, which speaks about the protection of life and personal liberty. No person shall be deprived of his life and personal liberty except according to the procedure established by law. So these are the three main articles which we call as the individual fundamental rights which need to be protected and are sought to be protected through various enactments as we see. We all know there are several enactments. I do not wish to go into waste my time in mentioning them one by one, but I will definitely want to focus as far as in today's times we are concerned with the Domestic Violence Act and the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act, which are very women specific and are meant only for women's protection. So we will definitely refer to them while we also refer to the various other laws, including the family laws. So here we are on to where we have seen the protection, the equality before the law. Then comes the non-discrimination, protection from the discrimination on the ground of sex. Third, the protection to life and personal liberty. And fourth, which would be the provision for enacting special provisions to give effect to the Article 14, 15, and 21 mentioned. So these are some things which we will have to consider. Now we all have studied jurisprudence, we all know, but just as a small short recap, jurisprudence, which is commonly known as study of science of law or the philosophy of law. The jurisprudence also justifies the law as it seeks to analyze, explain, and criticize the law. The main function of the jurisprudence is to justify why there should be law at all. It compares questions, confronts the law and legal concepts with the other fields as well. For example, we do all know when we talk about the criminology, we are talking also about the psychology, we are talking about the sociology, we are talking about the theories of punishment. So that is what the work of jurisprudence is when we see it as commonly or as a single one field. Jurisprudence examines the historical, moral, and cultural basis as well. This is a very important work that the jurisprudence does. The jurisprudence is the tool which helps us to interpret and implement the law, which is again a very important function which we see when the law is being practiced in the courts of law. It links and correlates the law with the practical and real world. So on one hand, there is a theory of jurisprudence which justifies and says why law, why the punishments, why the regulation, how much to regulate, how much to control. All this is justified through the jurisprudence, which is the philosophy of law. And this theory has to correlate with the practical aspects or practical life of people when it regulates the law. Now, when we have understood the theory of jurisprudence, or that it is a philosophy of law, what is feminist jurisprudence? Feminist jurisprudence is that branch of law which is based on political, economical, and social equality between the two sexes. So when we are talking of in terms of sexes, we have to understand that in the traditional terms, the sexes have always been binary, which is male sex and female sex. The feminists have identified gendered components and gendered implications of ostensibly neutral laws with reference to employment, divorce, inheritance, guardianship rights, reproductive rights, rape, domestic violence, and sexual harassment at workplace, etc. So the laws which seemingly appear to be neutral, there have been certain spaces which are gender biased, as we can say, and as reflected from various judgments. The language, logic, structure of the law are male created and reinforce male values by presenting male characteristics as they reinforce the as a norm. So the male standard is the norm, and female characteristics is seen as a deviation from that norm. The prevailing conceptions of law reinforce and perpetuate the patriarchal power and gender stereotypes. The gender stereotypes, gender, sex, and those concepts are a part of a completely different issue. I am not going into that right now. I presume that we all are aware of those terms and the definitions. The goal of the feminist jurisprudence is the feminist legal theory is to correct the imbalance between two sexes and to establish equality before the law. So wherever the law differentiates or creates a bias against one of the sex, which is generally the underprivileged and weaker section, that is the females, the feminist jurisprudence seeks to re-establish a balance between the two sexes. Now, what is the definition? We have understood generally what the feminist jurisprudence is. What is the definition of feminist jurisprudence? There are various definitions, various theories, various schools of thought. So I'll just take you through some very simple definitions which will introduce us the concept. Catherine Bartlett has defined it as a family of different perspectives or frameworks used to analyze the actual and desirable relationship between the law and gender. Another definition by Christine Littleton defines it as all attempts to explain, critique, and change law on behalf of and from the perspective of women is known as feminist jurisprudence. What is common between the different feminist jurisprudence theories and schools is that they focus on gender implications of legal rules and practices, as in how the legal rules and practices affect women, how law reflects and constructs the gender identities, the exposure and critique of patriarchal nature of substances and methods of law. So when we have understood that this is the feminist jurisprudence which wants to put forth the women's experiences in society which are not considered in the legal field as the part of interpretation. So then we can go ahead and see what have been the major schools or how has been this development of feminist jurisprudence taken place in almost last 60 years now. So there are various schools of feminist jurisprudence, out of which three are the major ones. It started in 1960s with liberal or the traditional school, where the traditional or liberal school asserted that women are just as rational as men are and therefore should have an equal opportunity. They demanded that the law should be gender blind to remove social and legal barriers that preclude women from equal opportunities. So here the balance was sought because men and women are equal. On that premise, the balance was sought as the equal treatment for the equals. However, this theory and the school was criticized that it promoted equality for the sake of equality, and which is why it was a tactical failure. Equal treatment of socially unequal individuals does not result in real equality, was the criticism, that one has to understand that the women's social position was unequal to men and therefore they cannot be treated as equal simply because they had to be brought on an equal platform. It also focuses on equality and it does not cover the existing inequality that works to its disadvantage, as I explained earlier. It follows that the male standard for comparison and therefore does not cover the women's issues like pregnancy and so on. So wherever we had the liberal school wanted to bring women at par with men to establish the equality, it would always take the male standard as a normative or as a norm, and it wanted women to be raised to the same standard to be equal to men to bring them at par. So this is what was criticized, that it does not account for the difference or it does not cover all the women's issues because it always has the male standard as a model before it. It was also seen as an overtly competitive theory that places sexes between in an adversarial position, which was not advisable. So when we come to the, after this school, we come to the second school of feminist jurisprudence, which was known as cultural jurisprudence. So while the liberal school focused on the similarities between the two sexes in order to bring them at par or to bring them at an equal status, the cultural school focused on the differences. And those differences, according to the cultural school, were qualitative differences in the sense it stated that these differences needed to be celebrated. So the goal of the cultural school was to prove women are similar to men, but they can function in a different way. And therefore, that was more important. So the cultural school wanted to establish or say that women had ethics of care while men had ethics of justice. How is that? Let us see. So their goal was to change the patriarchal institutions and systems to accommodate the women with this ethics of values. So here the ethics of care is relational problems while men use the ethics of justice. Ethics of care is about contextual approach to problems of law, which with values of empathy, relationships, while ethics of justice emphasize the abstract legal principles of rights and logic. So this was the difference in the cultural and the liberal school of feminism. The criticism again also rose against the cultural school, and the criticism was that the theory stereotyped the women again by saying that they had a culture or they had the ethics of values or ethics of care. And that is how the women were again portrayed or stereotyped into the portrayal of being naturally soft, being docile, being nurturing, and therefore it actually slid very comfortably with the existing patriarchal systems or the stereotypes. It was also criticized that it uses only academic and dignified language to glorify the traditional stereotypes under the garb of differences. An attempt to value the differences perpetuates the biases in practice. It was another criticism that in the name of the protective laws, the women are further discriminated by being denied the equal opportunity. One of the examples of this, if you recollect, was when the women are not in the under the Factories Act, the women were not allowed to work in the night shifts. There was a petition which said that they should be allowed because it amounts to the denial of an equal opportunity, while the provision for the law was more protective towards the women. So this was a progress from the cultural school, which actually said that the women should be also given protection and there cannot be a equality for the sake of equality. So the legal reasoning which justified the unequal treatment for protecting women on the basis of inherent differences amounts to perpetrating women's subordinate position was the argument against this theory of feminist jurisprudence of the cultural school. So going ahead from the cultural school, the next school that came into play was the radical school. The radical school was a very dominant or dominance oriented school, and which saw the equality issue as the issue of power distribution between the two sexes. And the gender question, according to the radical school, was the question of male supremacy over the female subordination. It objects to womanhood being measured by the similarity to the manhood or by the differences with the manhood, because that provides the law two ways to hold women to male standards and call it sex equality. So it rejected the traditional school, it rejected the cultural school, and it stated that both the school theories, the theories of feminist jurisprudence, only accorded two different ways to continue this subordination of women, because everywhere the norm or the standard was man. It did not take into account the woman as an individual into consideration. So the radical school says that the test is whether the laws and practices perpetuate the subordination of women. That would be the test to know whether a law is gender just or gender neutral. So according to the radical school, the feminist jurisprudence had to aim for substantive equality and not just legal equality. A criticism against the radical school also arose, which said that the focus is on control and regulation of women's sexuality because it spoke of subordination to men. The male supremacy and female subordination was through the control and regulation of the woman's sexuality was the criticism against the school. And therefore, the theory conforms only to the experiences of the heterosexual women. This was the time since when the feminist jurisprudence started changing its nature from binary sexual terms of male and females into different gender kinds. So, for example, the lesbian feminist actually criticized it only because the radical school only spoke about the heterosexual women's experiences or the jurisprudence aspect, which spoke about the male supremacy and the female supremacy. From this is where we are going into the actual subject of the this today's discourse. So here it was seen as a one-dimensional theory, and that it projected women as victims and not as individuals in their own right, because it's only opposed the male supremacy against the female subordination. Then we come to the next school, which is the postmodern school. The postmodern school is also a school just behind, just before preceding us or our times, I would rather say. So the postmodern school does not believe in a single theory or a single truth. It does not adhere or it does not contradict to the liberal, cultural, or radical school. It says there cannot be one single way of a solution, and it talks about the everything that comes from the women's experiences as a collective or a holistic approach is advocated by the postmodern school of feminist jurisprudence. They use the technique called deconstruction to expose the internal inherent contradictions of an apparently neutral legal concept or provision. They deny the stereotypical sex and gender categorization and see the individual as a constituted from multiple institutional and ideological forces that in various ways overlap, intersect, and even contradict each other. So here they are actually denying the stereotyping and categorization of a woman or a man, and they are talking about an individual who is formed through various influences, and those influences also can be overlapping or contradicting and contrasting, or they could those influences could intersect each other. So here for the first time the individual is considered, leaving behind the binary sex idea in the equality. They do not believe in a single solution as it will not unify all the women's experiences as alike. They demand inclusivity by keeping the doors open for all the possibilities. Criticism against this was that it is associated with the deconstruction. It had to destroy the existing theories in order to show how the gender bias was being entertained. However, this school did not give any constructive theory to go by. So there were no constructive principles or a theory of its own. It only spoke about identifying the gender bias laws by way of deconstruction. Secondly, it was also seen as a more of negative as it does not offer any alternative. It still is rooted in the existing theories of patriarchy or the systems of patriarchy, as one may say. Now, there are several debates. If we see all these schools of feminist jurisprudence, we will see that at different times these were employed for interpretation and for progressing with various laws. So there have been several debates which have arose out of these theories, and they are still going on. Those are the debates which we will never see the end of or never find a solution to. Just to make you aware, let me mention a few points here. One of that was I'm only giving the subject matters here or only the pointers here. I'm not going into the debate or the rights or wrongs or the theories of any of this for the moment, for we are only understanding what the feminist jurisprudence and how it is going to affect us in future, how it's going to change in future. So there were several debates in law as we consider all these various arguments at different points of these schools flourishing with their theories. One of them was the consent of sex, which we hear even today the cases, the consent to sex on the basis of promise to marry, whether this amounts to rape or not. This is still a debate which has been going on. There are various judgments, and it's a big issue which is being discussed. That if there is a consensual relationship, and later the woman says that it was on, I had consented on the basis of a false promise, which can be anything, which to marry or for any other reason, and therefore this is a rape. So whether this should be considered a rape or not is again one of the feminist theories, a solution which is found through the feminist theories. The question of how important is the character of a woman who is raped, victim of rape, it also refers to right of a prostitute to say no. There is a famous judgment on it. I'll be referring to it on the in the course of this lecture as well. So these are also part of the feminist thought. The issue of marital rape. Now that is again a very important part and parcel of the women's issues. It should, whether it should be declared as an offense or whether it is a part of sex, is part of marriage, and therefore one should be willing, it should not be termed as rape. Even such cases we have, the courts have decided, and we can see through the judgments as to what view the courts have taken. Whether a husband can outrage modesty of a wife, there has been a recent case wherein, or there have been plethora of judgments which say that it is quite possible even for a husband to outrage modesty of a woman. Whether at what age a female can have modesty, we know about the famous judgment where the Supreme Court had stated that even at a tender age of 3 months or since the birth, a woman of any age and every age has modesty attached to her womanhood, and it cannot be qualified or classified by her age or whether anybody is looking at her or not looking at her, and so on. Those are very progressive judgments, and we have continued with the stream of progressive judgments. Another issue that has come was about the bar dancing. We remember all the Maharashtra state banning the bar dancing or bar dances, and the case which had come at that time also the feminists have argued various arguments in favor, against it, saying whether the bar dancing can be a profession, whether it is part of the fundamental right to practice and profess. The same is the issue regarding the porn stars, people, actors who work in the pornographic films or pornographic medium. Then whether a similar thing is also extended, similar argument is also extended in terms of a professional sex worker. So whether a sex worker has this as her profession, whether the sex should be legalized or not, this is again a part of debate of various feminists, or is a feminist issue, and through various theories solutions have to be found for it. Then again, the question of woman's absolute right over her body with reference to the pregnancy and the childbirth, or her right to say deny a pregnancy if she wants an abortion and the husband wants a child, then what happens? So this right of woman over her body is also an issue in the feminist realm which has to be thought of. Then it also extends to the right of guardianship. As we all are aware, all the laws in India, as far as the guardianship laws are concerned, confer the right of guardianship, primary guardianship, on the man and not on the woman. We all are aware of that. There has been also Gita Hariharan's judgment, of which also we are aware. But that is again a case law, and it speaks again in a qualitative terms as to when the father is not available, a woman can be guardian. There is no absolute right which is part of the substantive law so far. So that is again an issue. The right of man over the woman's sexuality and the sexual autonomy of woman, which came for discussion in the case before the Supreme Court regarding complete abolition of section, resulted in abolition of 497. The prosecution is not now available to anybody. And if we see that judgment, it's a very progressive judgment, and especially the one which was worded by Dr. Chandrachud, the Honorable Justice Chandrachud of the Supreme Court, has been an excellent judgment and excellent reading in the feminist perspectives. We also saw the Hadia case, which brought forth again a different aspect. It spoke about the Khap Panchayats as well as the right of a woman, of her freedom to choose whom she wants to marry and what she wants to do with life, even before the marriage and after the marriage. Then also came the cases of regarding the property, referring to the section 6 and 8 of the Hindu Succession Act. So these are various issues which are about the case which was about inheritance. So these are various issues related to women and their life which come in the realm of the feminist and feminist jurisprudence. These issues need to be tackled not using any regular jurisprudential theory, but a theory of a feminist jurisprudence, because that is the advocacy of the women's rights, taking into consideration the women's perspectives, the experiences, social experiences, personal experiences of women, and finding the real justice, the substantial justice. So we go forward from this modern school, and now we come to certain judgments. As I said, I have taken very limited selected judgments. I am sure there can be a plethora of judgments if we even see the High Court judgments. And I have taken only very few selective Supreme Court judgments, which will take us to see how these various issues that we discussed have become part of the fundamental rights which are stated in the Constitution, which are given to us as fundamental rights, and how they have been implemented, interpreted in order to resolve these issues or conflicts. One of the important judgments, as we can see, before I go into those judgments, let me quote Dr. Honorable Justice Dr. Chandrachud here, which is the guideline which we can say, or the torchlight by which we can go. The quotes, all the three quotes which I am giving here are extremely important to make us understand what and why of feminist jurisprudence and what is their importance in the laws. Dr. Justice Chandrachud has stated, feminism is a lot about disrupting of social hierarchies, and that is what Constitution intends to do. The transformation involves disruption of existing social structures. So all those who say that these feminists are breaking families, are destroying the social structures, they are all they all need to consider this, what Justice Chandrachud has said, that it is all about the existing or established social hierarchies and re-establishing new structures, because the Constitution also presupposes that these structures are based in patriarchy. Now, next quote, as Dr. Chandrachud has stated, what is critical is that if as a judge you are giving effect to the constitutional values of equality, liberty, and fraternity, when you apply the feminist principles in deciding, you are only giving effect to this substantive equality of the Constitution. So, Justice Chandrachud has very categorically stated in one of his talks that Constitution is a feminist document. It does speak through Article 15(3) to create create such laws or such special provisions which will bring about the equality which is decided or as a duty cast upon us through the preamble to the Constitution. So the first thing, again I quote, the first thing that a judge needs to understand that it is that the law does not operate on pre-existing gender realities, but it contributes to their construction. Law attributes to the construction of gender identities. So Justice Chandrachud has very categorically summed up in these two sentences the kind of social engineering that is envisioned through applying the feminist jurisprudence and to various special laws which have been created specially to give effect to the fundamental rights. Going forward, with this, we can now go forward and see certain judgments which are passed by the Supreme Court. Let's take the 2020, I'm going reverse, the recent judgment, Ministry of Defense versus Babita Punia and others. This is a judgment passed very recently. It was celebrated also all over the news. This is regarding allowing women to be commissioned in army. The court, I again quote, the Supreme Court has stated, permanent commission should be granted to women in the army regardless of their service in all the 10 streams where the union government has already taken a decision to grant the short service commission for women. The policy to give women only staff appointments and denying command appointments due to their physiological features and domestic commitments was considered violative of Article 14 of the Constitution. And the bench observed that such policy perpetuates gender stereotypes. So, this is again a very woman centric decision, and where an attempt has been made to put women at par with male counterparts, saying that there cannot be an obstruction to by way of their physiological features or domestic commitments, and women were equally capable of assuming command appointments. Another important judgment which came was through Federation of Obstetric and Gynecological Societies of India versus Union of India and others. This is a 2019 judgment. Here under section 23 of the PCPNDT Act, it was stated that a smallest inadvertent unintentional anomaly in the paperwork can make the gynecologist and obstetricians liable for prosecution. And therefore, it was supposedly violative of Article 19, freedom to practice trade or profession, and which is why the Supreme Court was approached for striking down this Section 23, provision of Section 23 of the PCPNDT Act. The court held that giving preference to a male child is violative of Article 39A of the Constitution and against the mandate of Article 51A sub-rule B, which casts a constitutional duty on the citizens to renounce practices derogatory to the dignity of women. The bench observed that the female feticide is the most inhuman, immoral, and antisocial act, and the court further stated that the skewed sex ratio is likely to lead to greater incidences of violence against women and increase in the practices of trafficking, bride buying, etc. The court observed that therefore rigorous implementation of the act is an edifice on which rests the task of saving the girl child. The court refused to strike down the provision of section 23, 1 and 2 of the PCPNDT Act. The next judgment that we can see is of Joseph Shine. Again, this was Joseph Shine versus Union of India. This was a 2018 judgment. This is in respect of section 497 of the IPC, which was struck down as unconstitutional. There was a huge debate on this. This was also publicized very widely. This is an excellent reading. The entire judgment is an absolute study in feminism or feminist jurisprudence. So if we see the section 497, this judgment says the section 497 of IPC was struck down through this judgment as unconstitutional on the basis that the very basis for criminalizing the adultery was the assumption that a woman is considered as the property of husband and cannot have relations outside marriage. The said section was considered violative of the right to privacy as well as liberty of women by discriminating them against married women and perpetuating the gender stereotype. So it did not speak only about the gender or the discrimination between men and women, but it also spoke about discrimination between the married women, unmarried women, and single women and women who were in the families. So this judgment has taken a very broad perspective. It also emphasized that the sexual autonomy of a woman before and after her marriage and or divorce should remain intact as part and parcel of her right to equality, freedom, and liberty, and her right to live with dignity. So here, the sexual autonomy of a woman before and after marriage was considered to be a very important issue that needed protection of women. We come to the next judgment after this. The next judgment is Danamma alias Suman Surpur versus Amar 2018. Now this judgment was about with reference to Section 6 and Section 8 of the Hindu Succession Act. There has been a huge uproar since the amendment to this act in order to understand or to for explaining this amendment to its full this, because there were several ifs and buts that this amendment were argued upon. There were several cross judgments passed, and the Supreme Court with Danamma has decided this case to certain extent. While deciding this, because we don't know by the till the next judgment of the Supreme Court comes and sets aside this judgment, this is the final judgment, as we can see on this section. This I quote from the judgment: the right of a daughter to be entitled to an equal share as a son in the ancestral property, including daughters who were born before the Hindu Succession Act 1956, has come into force. So this judgment very categorically allowed women to be equal shareholders in the ancestral property of their parents as well. The court stated that a daughter should be treated as a co-parsoner since birth at par with her male counterparts, and that she is also entitled to dispose of her co-parsonary property. The court quoted Roscoe Pound while passing this judgment, which was, the law must be stable and yet it cannot stand still. Hence, all thinking about law has struggled to reconcile the conflicting demands of the need of stability and the need of change. We all know that the law is always fluid. It has to change with the times. Where there are no amendments to the law, the interpretations has to change. Where the judicial activism, especially in India, has been always in the forefront to be very progressive and taking us forward, leading us on the way of social engineering. This is one of the attempt through this judgment. Then we come to another judgment, which was also an important judgment, which spoke about the IPC, which criminalized, or rather protected a husband who had sex with his child bride if she was above 15 years of age. So there was this case where it was challenged, and in this case, the Supreme Court read down the exception 2 to Section 375 of IPC, which now stands altered as follows: sexual intercourse by a man with his wife, the wife being less than 18 years of age, is not a rape. So where the wife is above 18 years of age, it would not be rape. But if the wife was underage, that is under 18 years of age, even with her consent, even though she was his wife, would amount to rape. So here the woman's safety, health and security has been protected by the Supreme Court by reading down the exception 2 to the Section 375 of IPC. Earlier, the provision had prescribed that the age of 15 years, with or without consent of a wife below age of 18 years, it would be considered as an unlawful intrusion of the right to privacy and sanctity of a female. It was a dehumanizing experience for her. It is a serious blow to her honor, dignity, and offends her self-esteem and dignity. It degrades and humiliates the victim, where the victim is a helpless, innocent child. It leaves behind the traumatic experience. So earlier, this category up to 15 years was supposed to be the child, and if she was between 15 and 18 years of age, it would not amount to rape. While the law actually said that every person, or the matrimonial laws did not allow a marriage, or it held a marriage void if the bride was below 18 years of age. So this judgment actually brought both the laws or the legal provisions at par by saying that every child below 18 years of age was not fit for sexual intercourse, whether married or otherwise. Again, the traditional practice of child marriage was sanctified by this section, which allowed the husband of a girl child to have sexual intercourse with her regardless of her consent, provided that she was not under the age of 15 years. The court identified the harm to the child bride's right to maintain her bodily integrity if her husband is given the full control over her body, thereby reducing her to nothing more than his property. So this stereotyping or this conceptual holding has been taken away. The name of the case is Independent Thought versus Union of India. This is a 2017 case. Now, denying the whole category of a woman of the right to refuse the consent to sexual intercourse with their husband merely by virtue of being married similarly destroys the right of this category of adult women to their bodily integrity. Now, this again correlates it with the provision for marital rape. So, just as much as a child bride should have the sexual autonomy or right over her body as to when she wants and does not want sex, it should also be accorded to women who were married and above 18 years of age, is what the Supreme Court has noted. Thus, the basis of the violation of Article 21, as identified by the court itself, can be held applicable equally and in the same way to adult married women as it is to the child brides. This would pave the way for holding marital rape as an offense. Then we come to another judgment, which is about Kakali. The judgment is Kakali Ghosh versus Chief Secretary, Andaman and Nicobar Administration. This is a 2014 judgment. Here, the government has allowed, or I'm sorry, the court has allowed a woman to take a 2-year leave, a continuous, uninterrupted 2-year leave for childcare during the entire period of her employment. So a child care leave for the entire during the entire period of employment, an uninterrupted 2-year leave has been allowed by this judgment. I quote from the judgment: central government employee who is a woman and having a minor child can avail a maximum period of 730 days during the entire service period for taking care of her children. Unquote. The facts of this case were that the appellant had applied for child care leave for a period initially of 6 months for taking care of her child who was in 10th standard. While her application was pending, she was transferred to another place. She again sent a letter requesting for a leave for 730 days, but was allowed only 45 days leave. So it was this case, or with this background, that the appellant went to the court, and this decision that stated that she was entitled to avail a maximum period of 730 days leave during the entire service period for taking care of her children was an exemplary decision which understood, or which appreciated, that a woman may be the primary caregiver to her children, and her said responsibility of being a primary caregiver to her children is not limited to a particular age of her children. So it spoke about the entire period of employment, and for a long period, uninterrupted period of 730 days is a long period and may be necessary in certain cases. So then we come to the next judgment, which again we speak about. This judgment is about Anuj Garg and others versus Hotel Association of India and others. The Supreme Court examined and struck down a protective discrimination in Section 30 of Punjab Excise Act 1914 that restricted a woman's right to employment and equal treatment. What was this Section 30 of the Punjab Excise Act 1914? This provision prohibited employment of any man under the age of 25 years. So for a man, there was a qualifying provision that he should not be under the age of 25 years. But for women, it was a blanket provision that any woman cannot be employed in any part of such premises in which liquor or intoxicating drug is consumed by public. So here again, there was a protective discrimination, but it was struck off by the Supreme Court, saying that such protective discrimination was against the anti-stereotyping principle and the provision was therefore void and unconstitutional and discriminatory as against the reasonable classification under the Article 14 of the Constitution. The next judgment is about Municipal Corporation of Delhi versus female workers. Here again, those who were on the contract role were denied the maternity benefits. I quote from the judgment, a just social order can be achieved only when inequalities are obliterated and everyone is provided what is legally due. Women, who constitute almost half of the segment of our society, have to be honored and treated with dignity at places where they work to earn their livelihood. Whatever be the nature of their duties, their avocation, and the place where they work, they must be provided all the facilities to which they are entitled. Unquote. Here, in this case, the female workers who were engaged by the Municipal Corporation of Delhi raised a demand for the grant of maternity leave, which was available to only those regular female workers, that is the permanent employees, female employees. The same was denied to them on the ground that their services were not regularized. Now, the bench held that the provision of the Maternity Benefit Act 1961 indicates that they are wholly in consonance with the directive principles of the state policy as set out in Article 39 and in other articles, especially Article 42. A woman employee at the time of advanced pregnancy cannot be compelled to undertake hard labor as it would be detrimental to her health and also to the health of the fetus. Here, it cannot be said as the only as the protective judgment or a protective stand or protective discrimination, but here the reality of a woman having to undergo the pregnancy and the childbirth has to be considered as a biological difference between the men and women. Now, going ahead after this, there is this important judgment of state of Maharashtra and another versus Madhukar Narayan Mardikar. As I had mentioned earlier, I am quoting the same judgment here, which is an old judgment actually of 1990. I quote from the judgment, which is self-explanatory, and I don't think I would require further explanation on this. I quote, even a woman of easy virtue is entitled to privacy, and no one can invade her privacy as and when he likes. So also, it is not open to any and every person to violate her person as and when he wishes. She is entitled to protect her person even if there is an attempt to violate it against her wish. She is equally entitled to the protection of the law. Therefore, merely because she is a woman of easy virtue, her evidence cannot be thrown overboard. So, the easiest defense to any attempt or allegation of rape was that the woman was of easy virtue and therefore she could not have denied the advances, has been struck down way back in 1990 by this judgment. Now, we are proceeding forward. We saw the schools of feminist jurisprudence, the liberal, the cultural, the radical, the postmodern school. Now we are going to go forward to a further new era of feminism and see what are going to be the challenges to the feminist theories which we have so far understood. Now, what is this new era that we are talking about? This new era is the growth of inclusive human rights discourse. We are now talking about human rights, we are talking about inclusion, because there has been an argument which says that so far the feminist jurisprudence theories have been denying various categories of human rights within themselves. The feminist theories were so far based on binary gender or binary sexes, which was only male and female. Now, with various progressive judgments, we are breaking these barriers and opening ourselves to an open society. There has been a criticism against these theories, which says that these theories speak only about the privileged group of women, mainly the white or the upper class women, the upper and middle class women, and of the heterosexual women. This was one of the major criticism of these theories in today's time. They also said that it spoke about the gender imperialism for a simple reason. It spoke only of two genders, which was male and female. when it spoke about the oppression of female gender by the male gender. It did not take into consideration the various oppressions through the class of race, class, sexual orientation, etc. Through these periods, there has been an emergence of lesbian and gay jurisprudence as well. So when, as the various gender and sexual orientations are emerging, they are coming up with their own jurisprudential theories for beneficial interpretation, for protecting their own fundamental rights, and for their inclusion in the societal mainstream or the mainstream of law itself. The third world feminism is also another criticism that is coming to the fore in this new era, which criticizes the Western feminist jurisprudence for ignoring their experiences, which can be finding spaces for equality in the background of their social and cultural experiences. For example, in the Far East nations, or even for that matter in India, the cultural experiences or the social experiences of women can be different from those cultural or social experiences of women in the Western world. So the Western jurisprudential theories may or may not apply similarly to the theories which the Eastern world or the third world may find, the developed and the underdeveloped countries as well. We have seen that these differences are not included as part of the earlier schools of thought. And there has been, to some extent, there has been a religious setting to this as well. So going forward, what we are looking at, what is going to be the future of feminist jurisprudence henceforth, considering these backlashes, considering these various theories which are coming up as critical theories, criticizing the earlier schools of law, saying that you have not accounted for our experiences. So the future of the feminist jurisprudence, as we can see, has come to us through the various recent judgments as well. One of those we have discussed in Article 370, Section 377, abolition of criminalization of unnatural sex, discussing what is natural sex and what is unnatural sex. Then we also saw that in the abolition of or striking down of 497. So these judgments are taking us forward on this inclusive society parameters of the social engineering aspect which the Constitution guides us through. With the recent judgment of Honorable Supreme Court in Navtej Singh Johar versus Union of India, we have opened up to the possibilities of inclusive society in terms of gender and sexuality. So we are moving forward from the norms of binary gender or binary sexes argument. The feminist jurisprudence that work on the binary gender classification must give way to multiple gender inclusivity and multiple sexuality experiences. This will substantially change the argument of power distribution and male supremacy against the female subordination on which so far the feminist jurisprudence was based. So here when we talk about the various genders, multiple sexual orientations, we will not be able to restrict ourselves only to supremacy of male gender as against the female subordination. Now taking this forward, what we are being led through, I am just quoting a few due to the paucity of time and the scope of this lecture. I am quoting a few statements from each of those judgments, which will tell us which way we are going. So when we talk of Navtej Singh Johar, the Supreme Court, I quote, the choice of a partner, the desire for personal intimacy, and the yearning to find love and fulfillment in human relationship have a universal appeal. So here the natural intercourse or the natural sexual process was intimacy through a heterosexual process only, because the need of procreation, which led to it being termed natural, was taken away, and the Supreme Court says that the need for sexual intimacy is not just procreation, but it is yearning to find love and fulfillment in human relationship, and that it has a universal appeal. So it is a very important digression from the earlier concept. The Supreme Court further says, I quote, the state has no business to intrude into these personal matters, nor can societal notions of heteronormativity regulate the constitutional liberties based on sexual orientation. I unquote. So this itself shows that we are moving towards an inclusiveness of the multiple gender ideas and multiple sexualities. In Joseph Schein, which is reference to section 497, I quote, the realities of human life are far too complex to place them in closeted categories of right and wrong and subject all that is considered wrong with the sanctions of penal law. In both these judgments, the legal themes of constitutional morality, individual dignity, sexual agency, gender parity, and transformative vision of the Constitution have been considered at a great length by the Honorable Supreme Court. The first judgment is on section 377, as we saw. The second is on 497 of the IPC, but both of them have paved way for more open, liberal, and free social structures. They are moving towards breaking the stereotypical stereotypes of sex, gender, and sexuality and the accepted norms of social hierarchy. They are likely to have a profound impact on the institutions of marriage and family and the related laws. Let us see some further relevant judgments regarding this. As we saw, when section 377 and 497 have been abolished or their criminality of them is removed, when the Supreme Court is walking towards inclusivity in the society, we are moving towards same-sex marriages, sanction of same-sex marriages, same-sex family lives, surrogacy, adoption, all these issues, the family life, which will not be a heterosexual division of people, but it will be can be between the same sexes, and such multiple issues that are going to arise. If we see, it is as a let me mention this in the course of the lecture, that if we see, no single matrimonial law prohibits a marriage between same sexes until it comes to the provision of a valid marriage, the requirements of a valid marriage. It is only then that it says that there should be a bride, there should be a bridegroom. But it does not per se invalidate a marriage between the same sexes. There have been further judgments and there have been further cases. In the High Court of Kerala, there has been a famous case of Arun Kumar versus Shrija versus IG registration and others. This is a 2019 case before the Kerala High Court, where Shrija was a transsexual woman. She was a man earlier. She, by undertaking the surgical process, she changed herself into a woman and then she married Arun Kumar. However, the registrar refused to register their marriage, saying that she did not fit in the category of a bride as required for the registration. The court held, I quote, seen in the light of the march of the law, the expression bride occurring in section 5 of the Hindu Marriage Act 1955 will have to include within its meaning not only a woman but also a trans woman. It would also include an intersex person, transgender person who identifies herself as a woman. The duty consideration is how the person perceives herself. So here there is a very progressive judgment which has allowed a marriage between a man and a transgender or a transsexual woman, trans woman, as the court has stated. Now, this needs to be applied to the same-sex marriage as well, where a person may or may not have taken treatment. This we will see as the transgender bill is passed in the court, and certain further judgments, progressive judgments have come through, as we have seen in the discussion, as we have seen in the Navtej Singh Johar judgment as well. And the Nalsa judgment, let me not forget Nalsa judgment, which is very important. I quote again from the judgment. For too long, the transgender persons, intersex people have been languishing in the margins. The Constitution of India is an enabling document. It is inviting them to join the mainstream. Therefore, it would be absurd to deny the transgenders the benefit of the social institutions already in place in the mainstream. This is where we are going to. Now, what we hear is there is a petition pending for recognition of same-sex marriages in Kerala High Court, in which the summons has been already issued to the government. The petitioners have stated that lack of recognition violates their fundamental right to equality, equal protection of before the law, the right to life and liberty, and non-discrimination. They said that due to this, they have suffered public humiliation. I am sorry, I do not have the citation of this petition. It is still sub judice and pending for hearing, is what I have learned. So we can see that from this discussion and with this discourse of inclusivity of multiple genders and multiple sexualities into the mainstream, where the same-sex marriages are waiting sanction, and there will be a completely different structure of the family. Where does the feminist jurisprudence, where does the place of feminist jurisprudence lie? What kind of issues we expect to deal with? So legal fields that may be affected would be marriage and divorce, succession and inheritance, adoption, surrogacy, custody and guardianship issues of the children, the Protection from Domestic Violence Act, and the protection of sexual harassment are going to be two major fields, because they specifically speak about the male supremacy and female subordination. In fact, the entire acts are based on that. So when we are going to talk about the multiple genders and multiple sexualities, how will the jurisprudence work in this case? How will even the feminist jurisprudence work in this case? Going forward, what is the way forward for feminist rights then? So the feminist jurisprudence will have somewhere to seek its place in the discourse or the jurisprudence of human rights. We call ourselves a human race. The human race is further divided and classified in by overt physical divisions of race, sex, nationality, etc., and some more complex ones, which are like religion, gender, sexual orientation, which are complex ideas, especially when we talk about the multiple gender ideas, which are more learned, which are not physical maybe. So if we are looking at a social engineering aspect that aims to create an inclusive society, protecting the human rights of every individual, that is the benchmark, or that is the ideal that we are striving for through the entire constitutional effort is towards that. So what was seen as binary discrimination so far will have to be placed on the larger canvas of conflicts of interest within the multiple groups, and careful balancing of the interest would be required. Feminist jurisprudence shall be reduced to one of the subgroups of the larger unprivileged, oppressed, disadvantaged class from its status of the sole opposition class. So when we were talking about binary genders, we were talking about men versus women. But now that will not hold true, and the feminist jurisprudence will only become a subgroup in the entire discourse of human rights jurisprudence. The principles of feminist jurisprudence shall have to find their place in the realm of human rights to maintain their separate identity as women, and yet be inclusive identity as a feminist jurisprudence shall actually be the challenge before the feminist jurisprudence. So what would be the way forward? The way forward would be contextual reading and interpretation of law in the background of asymmetries of power in the social order, which could be between any group of humanity. Then we will also have to focus on our national goals, ideals, policy, and priorities in terms of social engineering, while interpreting or while using a theory of law or the philosophy of law while interpreting the law. And we will have to be open-minded for inclusive interpretations. This is a way forward. This is a part or how the feminist jurisprudence is going to develop. This is how the jurisprudence by itself will have to develop as we go towards more open and inclusive society. I think the time given for me is already up. I have tried to explain this subject as per my study, as much as I have tried to read from it. As the feminist jurisprudence also says, there cannot be one single solution to everything, but it is something which we have to go on progressing and we have to go on working on. I thank the organizers, Dr. Kalamkar madam, for giving me this opportunity to connect with you all. I hope you found this useful. I thank you all for your patient listening. Thank you very much. Dr. Kalamkar, over to you.
Yeah, hello, ma'am. Yes, there are some questions. I will just read out that questions, ma'am.
Yes, please.
Uh,
The participants, if they have any queries, they can just drop them in the chat box. Your questions will be raised and answered accordingly.
Before I go ahead with the answers, let me also say very humbly that I may not have answers to all queries right now, because this is something which is a developing or a future theory of jurisprudence which we all have to work on. Various judgments that will be passed in this course will lead us on as to what kind of social engineering is envisaged, and therefore we may not have a very definite answer to all our questions. I
Absolutely, ma'am.
hope that our listeners will pardon me if I am unable to satisfy their queries.
Absolutely, ma'am.
ma'am, there is a question from one Mr. Purushottam Kale. He's saying that the physical and psychological inequalities are beyond anyone to demolish. However, the current society and legislation definitely accepts the equality in all other areas. Women, however, have always been the staunch enemies of themselves. Is a common experience. So, what can be done about it?
Let us say, let us not make very general statements, because this also, according to me, is a very stereotypical statement, as one can say. It is a part of the backlash movement that took precedence in last, say, I would say in around 2000 or so, where the men always brought themselves out of this conflict and said that it is the story of conflict between the women and women, and the women are their staunch enemies. That is what is being asked in the question. What we need to understand here is there is always a conflict of interest between various groups and within the groups in the individuals as well. For example, let me put an example. When we talk about the Domestic Violence Act, there is a right of a woman to stay in her matrimonial home. In Marathi, if I may take the liberty, ज्याला आपण सासरचं घर म्हणतो. Now, where there is a mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law both staying in the same house under the same roof, which is their, त्या दोघांचंही ते सासर आहे. For both of them, this is a matrimonial home. So whose right needs to be protected? The mother-in-law's right or the daughter-in-law's right? So such conflicts within even the realm of the family shall always remain. There can never be a class without conflict. There will be always conflict within the members of the class also. And our courts have tried to resolve it by using the right of residence against the right of ownership. So these two rights have been placed against each other in order to balance out this conflict of interest. Naming such conflicts as by way of a general stereotypical term that women are the enemies of themselves and men are very innocent would be very wrong to say, because we have seen at various places where the men very quickly take a exit from the conflict, saying that asking the mother-in-law to file a case against the daughter-in-law and making it appear as a conflict between the daughter-in-law and the mother-in-law.
Next question, ma'am. Um, एक मिनट हाँ. In case of sexual harassment of women at workplace, how can the victim woman gather direct evidence to make her case strong? Circumstantial and hearsay evidence is easy to collect, but how can victim woman gather direct evidence which will make her case strong and clear?
This
Over
is
to you.
always, yes, this is always a problem when it comes to women-centric laws. And in fact, that is the reason why women-centric laws, or even the presumption that a woman's testimony, unless it has been proved to be false, should be considered as correct and true, have been required to be provided in the system. Because when we talk about the domestic violence, which is violence within the four walls, when we talk about the sexual harassment, these actions, or even the cases of sexual offenses, these offenses generally take place when there is nobody is looking, or when there is nobody who will come as forward as a witness. So the perpetrator always has a kind of a safety net, that there will not be any direct evidences. So here, such issues, or how she can collect, is not something which we may be able to say that this is the situation, अच्छा ये situation में आप ये करिए, या in this situation you do this. There is no such hypothetical answer that can be given. But in such cases, there is usually the circumstantial evidence or indirect evidence that is always used. And what can be done is, you can use a witness and create a trail of evidences behind you through the communications, by keeping a record of everything you do. That is the only solution to such issues.
Next question is from Amita Valmiki. She said, don't you think the postmodernists were right when they spoke of deconstruction, because in the back of it was always formal orthodox religion that boosted the arrogance of patriarchal society? To have an egalitarian society regarding gender issues, deconstruction is the must methodology to be implemented. Over to you, ma'am.
Yes. Basically, deconstruction is one of the tools and techniques, and not a theory. We need to understand that. So deconstruction only helps us to understand as to from where this law has come. It takes us to the beginning, and it takes us to the objective. It correlates with the reality of that offense or the situation, and helps us to come to real justice. But as I said, it is not a theory, it is a tool. And whether it is sufficient tool in every case or not has been the criticism. I am not a jurist to give an opinion on this, but definitely, as the postmodern feminist theories have propounded, there cannot be a one single solution, and we will have to take the entire gamut of the circumstances, or each question, or in each case, each circumstance may require a different approach. And that is precisely what the postmodernism allows, and therefore it might be more workable solution. But again, when we talk about the postmodernism, it does not take into consideration the multiple gender and multiple sexuality orientations. It still speaks about the binary, in terms of binary sexes.
Ma'am, there is a question from Nilambari Kulkarni. Are there any provision, special provision against honor killing?
Actually, those are the cases which I should have included in this, but for the paucity of time and space, I did not take them up. There will be case laws. There are no, yeah, we will look into them probably in the next session when we go into. There are so many complex issues when it comes to feminist issues, and the entire each issue can be followed with a trail of judgments to see how the jurisprudence or the interpretation has developed through the years.
Okay. Ma'am, there is a comment from one of our student, Subhash Gonial. Given that jurisprudence emergence from the laws of reasons, and that justice being blind is to be so seen and structured, such all person, irrespective of socio-economic status, religion, caste, creed, and sex are to be treated equally. The distinguished speakers, ma'am, has started in the end that in the current stage we have to expand to all groups. Why is then that we had a frame separate guidelines like the Vishakha guidelines? It implies a failure of the system is not being able to correct the existing administration, which failed to correctly execute the previous law, which does give directions to protect everybody, regardless of sex, from any form of harassment. Does it now
I
result that when we try to make a new law, despite previous laws being explicit in their directions, we end up further weakening the system is not being able to take the culprits, including within the administration, to task properly. Over to ma'am.
I Yeah, thank you. I would not say the observations made in the comment are right or wrong. I would rather be neutral and say that we need to understand, instead of categorizing this into black and white, that the laws have been enacted at different times based on certain different circumstances each times had revealed. But we need to understand that, though, for example, let us take the Hindu Marriage Act, let us take the IPC. These acts have been enacted so many years ago, but it is our judicial activism which has progressively interpreted these provisions to in consonance with the times. They have developed the law in such a way that at all times during the entire period there has been a flowing jurisprudence. We have always gone from progress to progress, and we will very rarely see regressive judgments coming from the Supreme Court. So I fully appreciate what we are saying, but we also need to understand that not everything is in the hands of the court. There is bound to be a time when we will have to assimilate these various laws into one single policy law when it comes to all these sections of the society, in order to give true effect to the concepts of equality, fraternity, and so on, which are part of the fundamental rights.
Um, and there are so many questions, but due to the time constraint, Evita madam, over to you for vote of thanks.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. I'm Ms. Avita Fernandez on behalf of HVPS College of Law and RJ College. Extend a very heart vote of thanks to our esteemed guest speaker for the day, Advocate Mrs. Zai Vaidya, madam. It was indeed a great privilege to have you here with us. And I'm sure that every listener present here has been enlightened and flabbergasted by your vast knowledge and deeper information and studies about the various spectrums of feminist legal theory and the several case laws associated to it. We thank you, madam, for having spared your precious
Thank you
time
so
with
much,
us.
everyone.
Yeah, ma'am. During this COVID-19 lockdown. I would like to thank our management for giving us this platform to spread out the right to information to the masses present here. Sincere thanks to our Honorable Secretary, Dr. Rajendra Singh sir, Director, Dr. Usha Mukundan madam, Dr. Himanshu Dauda sir, Ram Ranjan Jhunjhunwala College. Special thanks to Dr. Madhura Kalamkar madam, Principal of Hindi Vidya Prachar Samiti's College of Law. Without her effort and due diligence, this webinar would not be possible with 350 participants online on Zoom app and 25 live viewers on YouTube app. Thanks to Devi Prasad Shetty sir, Neha madam, our entire technical and support team. From the participants, I would like to thank various principals present here from different colleges, various advocates, all teachers, students, for being a wonderful audience. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
With this, we come to the end of the session. I hope all stay safe during this COVID-19 lockdown. Thank you so much. The participants, you might be coming across a screen for feedback. Please fill in that feedback form. Thank you. Over to you, Madhura ma'am.
No, nothing.
All
Meeting is
right, ma'am.
valid. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am.